Good morning again. I'm going to be reading to you, as you probably guessed, from Jonah in the Old Testament. And I'm going to jump around the first chapter a little bit to hit some of the key parts of the story, although Amanda did a wonderful job preparing us for that. Okay. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and such a mighty storm came upon the sea that the ship threatened to break up. And the mariners were afraid, and each cried to his God, and they threw cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. Jonah, meanwhile, had gone down into the hold of the ship and had laid down and was fast asleep. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you, so that the sea may quiet down for us?" For the sea was growing more and more tempestuous. He said to them, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea, and the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great storm has come upon you." But the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and for 3 nights. All right, so I was in a training program a few years back. Actually, it was about 22 years ago now. But I went to a training program to be certified to teach disciple Bible study, which coincidentally we'll be doing again starting here in just a few weeks for those of you who want to participate in that program. And at this training event, it was held in a big convention hall. And I walked in and I was looking, and the room was filled with large round tables, kind of like the ones that we have in the back of this room. And there was an open spot next to a woman who was probably, I would guess, in her late 50s. I sat down at the table with her, and we began to make conversation. And knowing that we didn't know each other and we were perfect strangers, but that we were there to talk about disciple Bible study, I said, "Well, tell me, do you have a favorite part of the Bible?" And she says, "Oh, I don't know, Tyler. I love the Bible with my whole heart." "Well, most of it." And she said, "I don't really love the epistles. So I don't really love that because I feel like Paul sometimes is unfair to women." And I said, okay. And she said, "And I don't like Revelation. That's weird. It's confusing, and I don't like it, and I kind of wish it wasn't in the Bible. And God seems so angry in the Old Testament. I don't really like the Old Testament very much either." And so I said, "So you like the Gospels? You like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?" She said, "And the Psalms." "Yes." And I said, "Okay." I just let it be. Now, her way of thinking is not at all uncommon. I've heard similar things from many Christians, and I think that there are times when we read the Bible, when we study the Bible, that there are parts of the Bible that feel like, I don't like that part so much, or that part's really confusing to me and I don't understand it, or even, I wish it wasn't there. You may know that Thomas Jefferson famously made the Jefferson Bible, where he just cut out the parts that he didn't like, and it was a very, very short book. But that whole idea is not unusual, particularly the thought that sometimes it feels like the way that God is described or depicted in the Old Testament, or we call it the Hebrew Bible, is very different than sometimes the way that we think that Jesus describes God. And so that idea is not a new one. In fact, it goes back really to the ancient in the early church. In fact, there was a guy named Marcion who believed that, in fact, it was an entirely different God, and that the God that we know was the God that finally was revealed through Jesus Christ. And Marcion stuck to his beliefs so firmly that he was put on an early church trial back in the days when they kind of did a lot of those kind of theological trials, and he was deemed to be a heretic. And so in the mind of the ancient church, this issue was put to bed almost 2,000 years ago, but the fact of the matter is that this idea, this way of thinking about God is still alive and well in many people's understanding of how they see God and God's identity and how we understand God throughout our reading of the Scriptures. And yet, I think that there is a response to that in, of all places, the book of Jonah. And so I want to talk a little bit about the book of Jonah today, and I want to talk about particularly some of the parts that maybe haven't been emphasized quite as much to many of you throughout the years. And certainly not the part of Jonah that we hear about in our time as children, or when we read Jonah's story at, for instance, maybe Vacation Bible School. And so I really appreciate Amanda highlighting a part of Jonah that I think is the more important takeaway than just the part about the giant fish or Jonah inside the belly of the whale. So to look at Jonah from a further distance, it's important to realize that Jonah has always been understood in the Jewish tradition and in the early church as something more like a parable than a story that is taking place with literal events. So if we find it problematic that Jonah feels like kind of an outrageous story, you're not alone. And so when we find stories like that in the Bible where we're like, come on, oftentimes, and I think that this is the case with Jonah, the point of the story is not, wow, wasn't that a trying and heroic kind of story that took place with this man named Jonah who lived a long time ago. The point is instead, what is this story, this tale, this parable, meant to teach us about who God is? Why do stories like this survive and are preserved and captured and canonized in Scripture if, when we read them, we say, oh, come on, thrown overboard, swallowed by a giant fish, lived inside the belly of the fish for 3 days, then spewed out onto the land? The point is to teach us something about God, not to teach us something about Jonah. So what is then the thing that we are supposed to glean from this story about God? First of all, this story is told well after the time period that the Assyrian Empire ruled. You may remember through different readings in the Old Testament that one of the main bad guys in the Old Testament, first it was the Egyptians, then we also have the Assyrians and the Babylonians, right? These were sort of the three mighty, powerful empires that made life terrible for the Hebrew people. And so Assyria is one of the ultimate bad guys in the Jewish narrative. This story is told as if there was a man named Jonah who lived during the time of the Assyrian Empire. Their capital city was Nineveh and was north and east in Assyria from ancient Judea, okay? So where Jonah would have lived. Jonah, being this reluctant prophet figure, is told that he is supposed to deliver a message, basically a turn away from your evil ways, citizens of Nineveh, or God has got it in for you. And he is supposed to deliver this message. Jonah is upset about this. He does not want to do this. And he heads off in a ship bound for Tarshish. And Tarshish means probably nothing to any of us, except scholars think that it was actually somewhere in coastal Spain. The distance between Nineveh, where he's supposed to go, and Tarshish is probably something like 3,000 miles. The story is told in such a way to communicate to us that Jonah is basically going as far away of where he's supposed to go as possible. It's almost like if God says, go to Los Angeles, and you say, I'm boarding a plane for Timbuktu, right? It's like that place that in our minds is far, far away. So Jonah deliberately disobeys, goes off in this other direction. Then he's swallowed by the fish after the thing happens at sea, the storm comes at sea, and he decides, okay, after 3 days, fine, I'll do it, whatever. And he heads to Nineveh, and he does this thing. When he gets there, as Amanda so well told the story to the kids, he says, okay, turn away from your evil ways, or God's going to burn this city to the ground. And unexpectedly, they respond. They do exactly as they're told. The king declares a fast. Everybody symbolically puts on sackcloth to show that they are repentant for their terrible ways. They feel terrible about what they have done. They are turning away, and God decides to spare the city. Now, you may remember what happens next, and this is the part that doesn't get told in the murals on the nursery walls. But Jonah is unbelievably irked. Irked is the worship-appropriate word to use. He's super irked about what God has done because he knows that what he would like to see is God rain hellfire upon his enemies. And when God says, nope, good news, I'm sparing the people, it is too much for Jonah to bear. And then he says this. He has a prayer with God as he's positioned himself on a hillside and he is ready to watch fire rain down on Nineveh. And when it doesn't happen, he says this to God. "O Lord, is not this what I said while I was still in my own country? That is why I fled to Tarshish at the beginning. For I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and ready to relent from punishing." This so-called angry God of the Old Testament that is so wildly different from the God that Jesus speaks of and seeks to emulate. This God who people like Marcion said, that isn't even the same God. Jonah says, the reason that I didn't want to go to Nineveh in the first place was not because I was scared that they would burn me at the stake for sharing news about how they were behaving poorly, not because I was there to offer a word of judgment from you, but because I was afraid of this. Because I know that deep down, you are a gracious God, merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and ready to relent from punishing. Which gets us back to the original question. If this is sort of an outrageous story, a parable that's supposed to teach us something about God, what does this also then teach us about ourselves? The truth of the matter is that when it comes down to it, the wrestling that we need to do with this story is more about us than it is about anything else. See, Jonah's story is unique because most of the time in the Old Testament, when a prophet is called to deliver a message, it follows this pattern. The pattern is God lifts up somebody to be a prophet who can go in and to proclaim the news that there has been something that has been done that has been an offense to God and to the people. And usually the form that it takes is that the prophet comes to their own people. So a Jewish prophet is raised up. The Jewish prophet goes to the Jewish community and says, listen, things have gone sideways here. You have become corrupt. The poor and the needy, the marginalized, the innocent, they are suffering greater because of your insensitivity, because of your selfishness, because of your greed, because of your lust for power, etc. And you need to turn from your wicked ways, care for your neighbor, particularly the least of these, and then God will spare you the wrath that you have honestly coming to you. Or the things that you have experienced now, as far as pain and suffering, are only a foretaste of what to come if you do not course correct immediately. That's the way that the prophet's message usually comes. The difference with Jonah is that God calls Jonah, the reluctant prophet, not to deliver a message to his own people, but to their enemies. That's what makes Jonah distinctive. Jonah goes to the mighty, terrible Assyrians, the massive superpower that has been oppressing his people, and he says, God's going to give you another chance, but you need to set aside your evil ways. And when they do, it bothers Jonah so deeply that he said, I would rather die than for you to offer mercy to our mortal enemy. The funny thing is that this sort of example of an emotion that many of us have experienced before doesn't appear a whole lot in the Old Testament, but there are numerous examples that Jesus lifts up in the Gospels. For instance, the parable of the vineyard, or the parable that Stephen preached on 3 weeks ago, the story of the landowner that forgave the slave his debt, but when the slave wouldn't forgive his person that he lent money to the debt, that God is outraged by it. The other story that comes to mind is that, remember the older brother in the story of the prodigal son. How that brother, when the little brother comes home, he's outraged because of the mercy that is shown to him. And so really, this is something that many of us have to contend with in our own lives. It's a wrestling that we have to do. What happens when God shows mercy to all people, particularly those that we have the most problem with? It's a hard pill for us to swallow, that God could be as merciful to our enemy as God is to us. Ironically, what we started talking about, which is God's identity, becomes really a question about our own identity, our own values, our own priorities. Are we able to say, God, I know that you are merciful, that you are gracious, that you are slow to anger, that you are abounding in steadfast love, and that you are eager to relent from punishing to our enemies? We like to make God play by our rules. We like a God that is created in our image. We like to define the rules of who's in and who's out, and who gets God's grace and who doesn't, and who should be exempt from that, and what line might be crossed for them to no longer be a worthy recipient. But that's not ours to deal with. It's God's. The part that we have control over is the wellness of our own hearts. Understanding that it is not about who God can extend mercy to, but it's about us getting on the same page as God when God chooses to extend that mercy to others. That's where the work needs to be done. So again, this story, if it's not necessarily a historically accurate true story, what's the message in here for us? The message in here for us is that it's not the Ninevites maybe who need to repent as we read the story. It's about us who need to repent. It's for all the times that we have put parameters on God's forgiveness and mercy. It's about all of the times that we said those people are worthy, but those people are not. It's about all of the times that we have been in the position of power and wanted to withhold God's grace to another. It's about all of the times that we have not looked at our friends, our family, our neighbors, and our enemies as those who are equally beloved in the eyes of God. And how do we turn from this way of thinking? Well, it's the same as Jonah declared. To turn away from that. To open our hearts to a different kind of way of living. To not go through an identity crisis of which voice will I follow, but instead following the example of Jesus Christ, who says, all are your neighbors. All are eligible for God's grace and love. And sometimes God allows us to hear that message clearer than others. Sometimes we understand it because of an experience or a relationship or a conversation or event, and it becomes clear as day. And other times God needs to send a forceful voice in the words and the messaging of a prophet, or maybe even sometimes a giant fish. But in order for us not to have that kind of selfishness swallow us whole, what we need to do is be open to the ways that God continues to move and show us that God is a God throughout both Testaments unchanging throughout time in terms of God's nature. And as Jonah said, so long, long ago as these words were penned and the story was first told, God, I understand you to be merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from punishing. So as I close this message today, I want to do so not just with a regular prayer to end the service and the sermon, but I want to offer a prayer of confession as well. So if you would you join me in prayer?